as an educator of students with disabilities for the majority of that time. He was born and raised in New York City, receiving his master's in education from Brooklyn College. Andrew now teaches math at the Cook Center Academy, which is a school for students with developmental, learning, and physical disabilities in Manhattan's Lower West Side. He has spoken nationally to advocate for equitable access to the highest quality math instruction for the typically underserved student population of students with disabilities. He writes about the intersection of math education, special education, and disability rights on his blog, andrewgael.com. The Learning Kaleidoscope is actually what it's called. You can follow him on Twitter with that handle and join him for the bi-weekly Twitter chat for students with disabilities and teaching math. And that's actually the hashtag SWD, Students with Disability Math Chat. So I am going to hand it on over to Andrew.
So as Christina said, my name is Andrew Gael, and I work at the Cook Center Academy. It's a nonprofit organization in Manhattan that works for students with special needs all over the city. And it has 3 private schools attached to it, and I work at the high school. So the students I work with are high school aged, but their cognitive levels, their instructional levels tend to be from K to 8th grade equivalency. So we are using a lot of influence from both elementary math education and middle school math education. So this presentation is going to be about how we integrate the principles of CGI for students with disabilities. Below you can see all my contact information. On Twitter, I'm BKDidect, and you can go to andrewgael.com for any more information about me. First, I want to ask, how many of you have heard this before? Whether you've said it in a professional development setting, thought it, or heard someone else say it. I think that this is a pretty regular thought when people are trying to integrate more complex mathematical pedagogies into their classroom. I know I've heard this, and it's something that I want to address in this presentation. So in one episode of the NPR podcast Invisibilia, the hosts of the podcast, Elise Spiegel and Lulu Miller, ask an interesting question that I'd like you guys to either turn and talk or think about on your own.
Do you think that the thoughts that you have in your head, okay, the private thoughts that you have in your head, could influence how that rat moves through space?
No.
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 And it was almost unanimous.
No.
People did not believe that their personal thoughts about the rat would have any effect on the rat at all.
Because that would suggest some sort of telepathy.
I mean,
now, I'd like you to think about what you think. Do you think the thoughts that you have in your head, the private thoughts that you're not saying out loud, can affect the physical behaviors, in this case, of rats in this experiment that they're about to talk about? I'd like you to turn to the person next to you, share what you think. The people in the experiment did not think that they could, that their thoughts would change somebody else's behavior. Now let's find out what they said.
as well. And if it is, you're wrong.
Yes.
This is a man named Bob Rosenthal, and early in his career as a research psychologist, he did something very devious. Late one night, Bob secretly crept into his lab and he hung signs on all of the rat cages. Some of the signs said that the rat in the cage was incredibly smart, and some of the signs said that the rat in the cage was incredibly dumb, even though neither of these things was true. They were very average rats that you would buy from a research institute that sells rats for a living. So then Bob brings this group of experimenters into his lab and says, for the next week, some of you are going to get these very smart rats and some these very dumb rats. And your job is to run your rat through a maze and record how well it does. That's right. So off the experimenters went. Can you just pick up the rat? We actually did a very lo-fi, unscientific version of Bob's experiment here at NPR. That's okay to do. Yeah. In Bob's real study, the experimenters did just as Bob told them to do. They ran the rats that they had been told were smart. She's sort of an intelligent looking face. And the rats that they had been told were dumb. Yeah, he seems kind of lazy.
So I want you to think about the comments that were made about these rats. When the experimenters were told that the rats were smart, they said something like, yeah, she has kind of an intelligent looking face. When the experimenters were told that the rats were dumb, they said, yeah, that rat looks lazy. And those are funny comments to us while we're thinking about rats in a scientific experiment situation. But how many times have we heard that spoken about children? It's not so funny when we think about it spoken about children. And so we want to think about our own expectations related to our students. I'm going to play a final clip from the podcast that is from Carol Dweck, who is a psychologist who studies expectations and
in people, because it turns out that this kind of dynamic happens in people too. You may be standing farther away from someone you have lower expectations for. You may not be making as much eye contact, and it's not something you can put your finger on. We're not usually aware of how we are conveying our expectations to other people, but it's there. That's Carol Dweck, a psychologist at Stanford. She was one of several researchers who explained all kinds of surprising things that expectations can influence, like teacher expectations can raise or lower a student's IQ score.
So this idea of expectations, especially when it comes to how our expectations, our inner expectations, affect our students. There's a direct connection between what we think about our students and their performance. So we want to talk about our expectations. And I'm going to show you a prompt on the next slide. And what I'd like you to do is turn to the person next to you or write comments in the comment section about your answer to the next prompt on the slide. What are your expectations for your students? We're talking to about how this one change to this question prompt changes your answer. What are your expectations for your students with disabilities? All right, I'd love for you guys to share your answers about how that one change to this prompt affected your thinking in the chat window if you feel comfortable. Next, I'd also like you to turn to the same partner and investigate this next quote from the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is a 5th edition, DSM-5. And this is the description of a language disorder. The core diagnostic features of language disorder are difficulties in the acquisition and use of language due to deficits in the comprehension or production of vocabulary, sentence structure, and discourse. The language deficits are evident in spoken communication, written communication, or sign language. Language learning and use is dependent on both receptive and expressive skills. So what I'd like you to do is just take a minute to note. You can either write it down, you can write it in the chat window, or just talk to a partner. What do you notice about the characteristics of language disorders? And from what you currently know about cognitively guided instruction, how can these components affect how a student relates to cognitively guided instruction? I'll give you guys a minute to think about it or note to your partner. When I think of cognitively guided instruction, I think of a lot of language, both comprehension of language and expression of answers and thinking through language. So my worry would be that there's a lot of barriers that might exist for someone who had a language disorder in my class if I was going to incorporate cognitively guided instruction. The problem with worrying about implementing a type of curriculum with a certain kind of students is evident in this graph, which is a meta-analysis of a lot of different components of mathematics classrooms with students with significant cognitive disabilities, which includes language disorders. As you can see, there's a very heavy concentration on things like counting and calculating. There's a huge concentration on money skills. And those are all very important, and I'm not advocating that we don't study money skills with our students, but things should be a little bit more equitable. Do you think that this graph represents a rich and equitable mathematics curriculum for students with disabilities? That was in a study done by Jackson and Neal in 2008. And I'm going to tell you this story through 4 statistics, through 4 percentages. Now, in this school, the general ed classrooms were broken down into these 2 percentages. And don't ask me where the other 9% was. I didn't do the study. I just relate these stories. So the general ed classroom breakdown was 30% on procedures and memorization and 61% on learning concepts. And we know that learning concepts and learning and procedural fluency go together to create a rich mathematics classroom. And so this is a little bit more equal as opposed to this. Now, I would give you some time to think about where you think these statistics fall, whether it's procedures and memorization or learning concepts, but I don't think that there's any surprise that the special ed classrooms focused only 18% on learning concepts, especially when we integrate the graph from the previous slide. Now, the best part about CGI is, to me, I believe that it bridges the gap between teaching learning procedures and